Okay, we're ready to now get into the part of the semester that is really my favorite part and where most of my training was at, and that is in the field of ecology, looking at how organisms, plants and animals, so forth, interact with one another in nature, looking at sort of the whole picture of life. And the first thing that's good, I think, is to define a couple of words. First of all, the term ecology is simply means, it comes from the word oikos, which basically means the house or the environment. So ecology is the study of the environment. And probably a term you've heard before, the word habitat is just simply a place where an organism lives, sort of a general term to describe where an organism lives, including humans. So all these terms can really be applied to humans as well as plants and fungi and other things like that. Another term that you probably heard before, but the definition is often used sort of incorrectly, is the idea of a niche. Okay, a niche. And a niche in biology or in ecology, same thing, is simply that it's an organism's job in an environment. So a lot of people think of the word niche as being like a location or a place. And in biology or ecology, when we use the word niche, what we're really referring to is not just the place, but rather what the organism does there. So for example, probably by now you already know I'm not very good at drawing, but let's say you had a tree, okay? And below the tree, you had another plant of some sort. And the plant lives underneath the tree. And both of them do photosynthesis and therefore are able to make their own sugar. And one of the things that comes out of them is O2, for example. Well, the tree being really tall is maybe exposed to more sunlight, and the plant below is sort of shaded. So they do different things slightly, but to really show you the difference, if I draw a mushroom here, so there's my mushroom. Once again, I'm a biologist, not an art major by far. The mushroom doesn't do photosynthesis, but notice that this plant and the mushroom, they live in the same sort of area, but they do very different jobs. This one's a decomposer and breaks down decaying matter underneath the tree and so forth. This one does photosynthesis, so they have different jobs in their environment. And then the next thing that we introduced when we talked about evolution, so you've seen this before, but the idea of a population, a group of individuals capable of reproducing, that gets us into what we call population biology, looking at how one particular species might change over time. And one of the things that you can look at when you're talking about, we'll start with population biology, sort of looking at one species by itself, is you can look at how they're dispersed. Okay, so one thing you find in these dispersion patterns is some animals are clumped, meaning you don't find them scattered evenly about, but rather they're clumped. And an example of that would be like wolves. Wolves hunt in a pack, and so you don't tend to find wolves spread out evenly, but rather if you find one wolf, you're probably going to find a bunch of them because they hunt in packs. Other animals are more uniform in their distribution as they sort of push around and compete, like these penguins here. There's only so much space, and so each penguin sort of tries to defend its own little space from other penguins, and you get a very uniform distribution that way. And then other times it's kind of random, meaning there seems to be no pattern to it. There's maybe a bunch here and a few there, but there's no pattern that is visible for that. Most of the time you don't see more random patterns. Usually you see either clumped or uniform. You see some sort of pattern to it. The other thing that can be interesting in a population is how that population grows or changes over time. And if you took like 2 rabbits, for example, one of my best drawings, once again, you know, people make fun of me, say it could be a 2 rabbits, or it could be a duck looking at something over here, like this is their bill, you know, whatever. Doesn't really matter. So anyway, you have these 2 rabbits, and if these 2 rabbits reproduced, maybe they could have a bunch of babies, and if those reproduced, you could have even more babies, and it doesn't take long, as you see, and you know this is probably particularly true for rabbits, but other things as well. But you can end up with a lot of rabbits really quick. And that idea is called exponential growth. Okay, so exponential growth is growing just at the rate relative to what reproduction allows you to do. But what you find in most living systems in the world is that there's some point that we call the carrying capacity, often represented by the letter K, carrying capacity, where what happens is you run into resistance by the environment. You start to run out of food, you run out of resources, there's not enough space, and so then you get competition, and that is, therefore, what we see in the real world is more what we call logistic growth. Okay, so exponential growth happens like in a petri dish or that kind of thing where you can keep supplying nutrients. But as you start to run out of food or as you start to produce too much waste, the competition starts to limit how high you can grow. And again, that's called carrying capacity. Things that can limit population growth kind of fall into two categories. One is density-dependent factors, and the other is density-independent factors. Just like their name implies, density-dependent factors are things that matter more depending on the density. So food and shelter and water, for example, are all density-dependent factors, meaning that as you add, say, humans, for example, as there's more and more humans in the world, unless you can make more food some new way, you start to run out of food, or you run out of water, or you run out of shelter. Density independent factors are things that doesn't really matter how many individuals you have, you sort of get the same effect. Okay, hurricanes, floods, spread of disease, although things that humans do, for example, might increase the chances of floods or hurricanes. The hurricane itself or the flood itself, whether you have 10 people in a population or 100,000 people, the idea is that the flood kind of will come in and maybe, wipe out a certain population and certain percentage of the population, and it doesn't really matter how big that population is. The flood itself has sort of the same effect in its direct nature. Then the next thing we can do is move up from population ecology, and so we start off with an organism like a frog, and that group, if you put a group of those together, you get a population. That's what we were just talking about. But if you put all the populations together, you get what's called a community. So a community is all the biotic or living things together. So in this case, you have looks like some kind of great blue heron and some frogs and a dragonfly and the grass. Whereas over here, you just had the frogs. So now you have like these multiple populations. There's some fish in here as well. And so all these things interact. If you take all the living things, all the community things, and you add to that the non-living things. So abiotic, biotic means living. All right. Abiotic, A in front of anything, basically means without. So this is the non-living things. So like rocks, for example, or soil. So if you add the abiotic things to the community, you get what's called the ecosystem level of looking at it. And that's what we'll talk about in the upcoming lecture next time. And you put all those together and you get this biosphere, which is basically the whole planet. As you start looking at the interactions of organisms, one of the things you find is that certain organisms eat other organisms, and that gives you the idea of a food chain. So in this case here, let's say I have a plant, which is a producer, which basically means it produces glucose using solar energy, uses light. Okay, so you can learn this back. This is where we put things together. We use light, we use CO2, and those all are inputs. And what you get out of that is O2, which is not the big thing that matters to the plants, but you get glucose. And the glucose allows you then to go through cellular respiration and make ATP to do things. Okay, well, those are producers, and that's at the primary level down here, the first level. Well, things that eat the plants are the consumers. So the primary consumer is like an herbivore, something like an insect that eats the plant. A secondary consumer is like a carnivore, something that eats the insect. And as you move up, you have tertiary and quaternary consumers as you move up the food chain like that. Often you find, though, that those food chains, they're nice simple models where if you have one species that eats only one species, you get a nice clean food chain. But in reality, most things eat a variety of things. So this is the idea of a food web. So this starts to get more complex. So if you had a bunch of plants, for example, those are all the producers in this case, like some kind of desert ecosystem. But then you'll notice that what ends up happening is that different organisms feed at sort of different levels. So for example, the snake here, okay, the snake might eat the mouse, and so might the hawk as well. But the hawk might also eat the snake, for example. Okay, so in this case, they're trying to show you these are tertiary and secondary consumers and all the way up. But sometimes one thing at the top might actually eat a variety of things down below it, depending on the season and how many there are, and that can vary by location and all kinds of things like that. One of the things you notice, though, as you do this, as you look at these food chains and food webs, is you can develop this idea of what they call an energy pyramid, where if you look at how much energy is available or how many amounts of calories are available in that one level, say the producers, what you find is that it forms this very pyramid shape where if you look at the plants, for example, there's a whole bunch of them in an ecosystem or it could be marine system too. It's a little bit different, but a whole bunch of producers. And then as you go to the primary consumer level, you notice there's a big drop very, very quickly in the number. So notice that you went from this big wide base to being this very narrow base. And then if you go to secondary consumers, it gets even more narrow, and it gets more narrow as you move up. Okay? And this is why if you go out on a hike, say for example, and you go on a hike out in the mountains and you see a bunch of trees and everyone's worried about, well, what if we run into a mountain lion or a bear or that kind of thing? The chances that you're going to see trees is extremely good because really, really big base here because of the energy pyramid. But as you move up, things like mountain lions are just very rare. You don't see a lot of mountain lions because they're at the very top of the food chain. And the reason this is true, you might remember this back when we talked about enzymes. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. And if you remember that, you might remember the word entropy. I ran out of room there, so I'm going to write the rest of it there. Thermodynamics. Essentially, as you move up the food chain, what ends up happening is as one organism eats another, it doesn't get all the calories that are available in it because you're always losing some of the energy as heat. Okay? Nothing, no system, no transfer of energy is ever 100% complete. And so you notice that as you have all these calories in the plants, as you move up, you very quickly, you're losing 90% of your calories right away in the herbivores. It's very inefficient. And then as you move up again, you lose more. And so things like mountain lions and humans that eat nothing but meat, that is pretty rare at the top of the ecosystem, which is why predators and large, big predatory things with teeth and things like that tend to be rare because of the second law of thermodynamics. Something to keep in mind and think about. The other thing that we can look at is how not only does one thing eat another thing, but how they interact with one another. So some of these we kind of were talking about already, but two organisms, if they interact in such a way, they could compete with each other, where in one case, one organism is harmed and so is the other. And by harmed, we're usually talking about energy. So if two organisms compete for the same food source, both organisms, because they're competing with one another, one might get the slight upper hand over the other, but if they're trying to eat the same thing, they're both at a loss somewhat because they could eat more if the other wasn't around. So the analogy I like to use here is, let's say you're going for a job. You're trying to find a job, and you're the only one going for the job. You're the only applicant. If you're the only applicant, you don't have to really try all that hard. You don't have to buy a new suit, and you don't have to be on your best behavior and go in there and be really good. But if you have a lot of competition for the job, you're going to have to really up your game maybe. Maybe you got to go buy a suit and practice and put some energy into that. So competition occurs when one or more people, for example, are going for the same job. And that's the same thing that's true in an ecosystem when two things compete, in this case for food. Predation and parasitism is mainly what we're talking about with the food chains, but one thing might eat another thing. And obviously, if you're a snake and you eat a mouse, the snake is gaining because it's getting energy and calories by eating the mouse. And of course, the ultimate level in life of losing is getting eaten. Because once you're eaten, you can't reproduce and things like that. So predation, parasitism would be like you have a parasite. A parasite gains at your expense, for example. In mutualism, what happens is two things interact in such a way that they both benefit. Okay, so maybe one organism, as it walks along, and it has, for example, there's rhinos, for example, that have these birds on their back, and what happens is the rhino is walking along eating grass and things like that, but it gets insects on it, so that are biting it and things like that. Well, these birds will eat the insects off of the rhino, so the rhino benefits because it's getting the bugs eaten off of it. The birds benefit two ways. One is they get the insects off the rhino, and the other is if you're a bird and something might eat you, it probably won't mess with the rhino. So in that case, mutualism, both of them gain. In commensalism, one of them gains and the other is unaffected. So in that same example, there's some debate that goes on how accurate commensalism might really be, because sometimes we wonder, well, maybe the other is affected some way. So in the same example, like let's say you had the rhino, and the rhino's walking along, and it scares up insects that the birds eat. Well, if the rhino isn't affected either way, like if there aren't bugs biting the rhino, then the rhino could care less whether the bird's there or not. So the rhino in that case would be unaffected, but the birds would gain because maybe as the rhino walks, it scares up insects that are in the grass. That would be the idea of commensalism. So next thing I'm going to do is talk, okay, well, if you're a predator and prey, you would think if you're the prey that over time you would kind of try to not be the prey. And so a lot of evolutionary force, we believe, goes into, if you're a prey, trying to get around that. So there are many examples. One is the best thing to do is maybe not be found at all. And that's called camouflage. So camouflage means you're simply blending in, and it makes it difficult for you to find. So a lot of organisms have the ability to blend into the environment and not be seen. The other is some organisms like poison dart frogs have evolved the ability, mainly they eat these centipedes and will accumulate toxins, and they become very toxic. And if you're a very toxic organism or you have some weapon of defense, a lot of these organisms are what we call aposematically colored, or aposematic coloration. They have warning colors. And a good example is like a skunk. Okay, so skunk has this, it's not camouflage. The skunk has a very obvious black and white pattern that's very noticeable and stands out. And unless you're my dumb dog that seems to still chase down the skunk and has been sprayed 3 times, most people don't mess around with a skunk, because you learn, hey, black and white, you don't mess with that pattern because that's a skunk. And a lot of animals are that way also. So bright colors are usually a warning sign that the organism is dangerous or something like that. Now, because of that warning color, because of that pattern in nature where there's dangerous colors, a lot of things have evolved this idea of mimicry, and we have two cases. One's called Batesian mimicry, and the other is Müllerian mimicry. I'll just start with Batesian mimicry first. Okay, so in Batesian mimicry, what you have is you have one that's dangerous or venomous, and the other is not. So a good example, most people, once again, bad drawings. Here's a bee. All right. Most of the time, people know, hey, if that thing's a bee, you learned about the black and yellow sort of stripes of a bee, and you don't mess around with a bee because you don't want to get stung, okay? Some people are actually deathly allergic to bee stings, and it can be quite bad, but even if you're not, most people don't mess around with a bee, okay? But it turns out there's some things, like there's a couple moths and there's a couple of flies that have evolved color patterns that sort of look like a bee. And so you don't mess around with them even though they're not dangerous. Even though they're not dangerous because it's a moth or it's a fly and it can't really sting you. You're not quite sure because it sort of looks like a bee. And animals do that as well. So that's Batesian mimicry, where one is dangerous like the bee and the other is not, like the fly or moth that mimics it and looks like that. In Müllerian mimicry, the idea is both of them are dangerous. So you might have a bee and you might have a wasp. So there's my wasp. I guess I'll have to label it because it doesn't look anymore. It has a longer body, which means nothing probably, but that's okay. So I have a bee and we have a wasp. And a lot of bees and wasps have the same kind of pattern. The black and yellow pattern is a very common theme among bees and wasps. And although the bee and the wasp are different species, they're not related to each other. That pattern is a very useful pattern for both of them to have because predators kind of leave both of those alone. So in Müllerian mimicry, two things sort of look like each other, and the idea is they look like each other because that pattern works for both of them. The last thing I want to mention is that whenever I do the ecology section, people usually understand the basic ecology stuff pretty well. This thing eats that thing. It's a pretty simple element in some senses. And a lot of people, I think, are led to believe, hey, I really like this section compared to, say, cell respiration or photosynthesis, where we had to memorize all those steps and look at all those chemical reactions and learn all those molecules. But I want to point out that this is a fundamental error in our total understanding of the whole thing. So keep in mind, and this concept's called emergent properties. Okay, so ecology, it turns out, if you really get down to it, it's really complex. It's really hard to understand the ecology of a whole system. So people sort of get the idea, hey, here's a predator and here's its prey. And if you take away the prey, it changes the predator. But it's too simple in nature, really. So if you think about all the stuff we've talked about, molecules, larger molecules, macromolecules, organelles, cell respiration, photosynthesis, and all that, those things are still going on in the animals, plus all of the other stuff. So ecology is very complex, and one of the terms they use to describe that emergence of properties is the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So to give you an example, you would not probably think that your car is a simple machine. There's a lot of complexity that goes on in the engine of a car, for example. But if you took all of the parts of the car apart, you would have a lot of parts. But they would not be a car, really, unless you put them together. So the parts themselves are just parts. But the way the parts all go together, and if they go together correctly in the right way, and they all work together in unison, you get the car and the car moves. And ecology is very much that way also. So I just want to point out that just thinking that, hey, I understand there's a predator and a prey, that's too simplistic of a model to really understand how ecology is. And so even though we make it seem simple, it's an error in our understanding. If you really want to understand an ecosystem, it's really hard to look at all the parts together and how they interact.